My name is Jerm. This is Jerm Warfare, the battle of ideas.
Grover Furr, thank you for joining me in the trenches.
I'm very pleased to be invited here, Jeremy.
This is such a big topic. I've always wondered about Stalin. I guess it's fitting if I just quickly ask about you and your background.
Well, I was born in the United States, Washington, D.C. My father was off at the war. Then he got a job in Montreal, and we moved to Montreal when I was just 2 years old, and I grew up there. And then I came down to the States to go to graduate school and stayed here to work at Montclair State University. That's about it. I got interested in, let's say, Soviet history because of the anti-Vietnam War protest movement, which I got involved in as a student, and the issue of Stalin came up any number of times. Now, I have studied, and I was studying, how to do research. I got my doctorate in medieval European and English literature, and so research methods were an important part of what I was concentrating on. And it was clear to me, once I started to look into that question of Stalin, that there really was no decent evidence at that time. All of the books about Stalin relied on quoting other books, which quoted other books, but they never got down to any real evidence. And of course, Nikita Khrushchev's secret speech was not accompanied by any evidence. That was 1956, the famous attack on Stalin. So I got interested in Stalin just because of my involvement in the anti-war movement. Sometimes those of us who were involved in it were called Stalinists. And I did a little work on it, but in fast forwarding to 1999, a Russian historian, an amateur historian, contacted me and said that he liked one of the articles that I had published and put online, but that I was clearly unaware that since the end of the Soviet Union, a great many documents from former Soviet archives were beginning to be made available, and they needed to be taken into account. So with the guidance of my colleague now, Vladimir Bobrov in Moscow, I started to study those. And I realized that here we have some primary source evidence, and the primary source evidence simply refutes the claims about Stalin's crimes that were virtually universally accepted. So my first book was called Khrushchev Lied, and what I did was I went through Khrushchev's secret speech of 1956. I hadn't read it in many years, but I had some vague memory about it, and I started to compare what Khrushchev's accusations with the documents from Soviet archives that were available at that time. So we're talking about 20 years ago, and I saw that right away that a number of the statements that Khrushchev made could be refuted, disproven by the documents that we had access to now that the Soviet Union was gone. And what started out as a small article, I was going to just deal with a couple of Khrushchev statements, eventually turned into a whole book. And I found out that there's no accusation that Khrushchev made in that speech that can be supported by the evidence, and many of his statements can be affirmatively disproven. That is, you can actually prove that they're false, as opposed to simply, let's say, not supported by evidence. So evidence is very important. And the other issue I would say is objectivity. There's very little objectivity in the study of Soviet history, particularly of the Stalin period. People proceed from their preconceived biases, and that forecloses your ability to discover the truth, because you're looking to cherry pick whatever evidence you can find that will support what you already believe. Armed, as it were, with the conviction that it's necessary to be objective and continuing to collect and investigate the documents from former Soviet archives, I've just proceeded since then to research various aspects of the Stalin period in the Soviet Union.
The common narrative is that he was, born in 1878, I think, and he was abused by his father.
There's no evidence that he was abused by his father. I know that's a story, but it's without foundation. It's without any decent foundation. One of his schoolmates, when he was a child, named Irimashvili, wrote a book in German in the early 1930s in which he made that claim and other claims. But they have never been supported by any evidence, and even the most recent, let's say, anti-Stalin but professional historians, like Stephen Kotkin, just dismiss them. Irimashvili later became a Nazi supporter. He lived in Germany. He died in Germany during the war. So I would say that story is not. You don't find it even in contemporary anti-Stalin literature any longer.
So what was Stalin's upbringing?
Well, he went to school. He went to a religious school and was expelled for political activity. He joined the very active and clandestine social democratic movement in Georgia, where he lived, where he was born and raised. And he was raised at a time when there was a lot of revolutionary activity on the part of various groups predominantly underground, and not just in Georgia, but throughout the Russian Empire. So there was a lot of this kind of activity going on. And Marxism was very influential. So there was many of these groups knew to concentrate on the working class, and the Russian Empire was gradually becoming industrialized, although it was still far and away behind Western Europe. Nevertheless, it was taking place. So there was a considerable working class. And Stalin got very active in that movement in Georgia, was arrested a few times, exiled a few times, and the last time he was arrested and exiled, 1912 or 1913, he was sent to Siberia, where he remained until the February Revolution of 1917, when basically all of the political prisoners just picked up and left their camps because the Tsarist government had ceased to exist, and they were able to do that. So he put his butt on the line for many years and was a worker, an organizer, a clandestine revolutionary. There was a very active. It's not like he was all by himself. I'm trying to paint the picture that there was a very active revolutionary underground, which a person like him could join and be a part of right away. And he, of course, was good at it. And at some point during this period of time, when he was still fairly young, he became acquainted with the Bolshevik literature, Lenin's party, and gravitated to that party. when the February Revolution took place, that's when the Tsar was overthrown, and there was a capitalist, a sort of social democratically leaning capitalist regime organized in Moscow. So Stalin went to Moscow. He assumed his position as one of the editors of the Bolshevik newspaper Pravda, and that was, I think, in March 1917. Lenin returned from exile in Switzerland in April 1917. He was a charismatic figure. Stalin and others gravitated to his leadership. Stalin had followed him before, but, at a distance. Then the Bolshevik Party was involved in various struggles. During 1917, there was an attempt at a seizure of power by some workers in July. The Bolsheviks joined. It failed, and from then on they were pretty much underground. But as you know, I'm sure, at the end of October 1917, by the Julian calendar, beginning of November by the Western calendar, they organized this seizure of power, not only in Petrograd, as St. Petersburg was called then, but in a number of other important cities and centers in Russia. Stalin was in Petrograd, and he was involved in the organizing of the seizure of power, as were others, as was Leon Trotsky and others who later on became highly placed leaders in the Bolshevik Party. Now, then, is that where you'd like me to stop, or shall I continue on?
Yeah, I was just going to point out that the popular narrative is that it was like a scheming takeover.
Well,
yeah.
So so most of the books, let's say, that deal with the Russian Revolution really concentrate on Petrograd, formerly St. Petersburg, and later on Leningrad, right? Because that's where the government was centered, and that's where the revolution. There was one revolution there, and the Bolsheviks had a big base in the working class, and they mobilized that base, and they seized the main seats of government in the city of Petrograd. But there were similar uprisings in many other places. So if it was just Petrograd, you could say, well, it's a little bit like a coup, with not all that many people involved and no demonstration of any kind of deep roots among the population. But the same thing happened in Moscow. The revolution in Moscow was, in some respects, much more interesting because it took a longer time and was much more violent. There was little violence involved in the revolution in St. Petersburg in 1917, but Moscow was very different, and the Bolsheviks had a lot of support there, and they seized power there too, as well as in other cities. So the version of the Bolshevik Revolution that just concentrates on what happened in Petrograd, gives a distorted picture of what really occurred.
Just for clarity, who were the Bolsheviks?
Well, okay, so Vladimir Lenin started to organize a political party in the 1890s. And the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party. And then in 1903, there was a split between the two parties that in the split became known as the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. Lenin's party was the Bolsheviks. And although they remained formally one party, they in fact were were organizationally separate because they had very different views of how to make a revolution. So the Mensheviks followed the more or less the template of the Second International, which was at that time, the socialist parties of Western Europe and the United States. And the Socialist Party, the socialist parties, the socialist movement, the Second International was itself split between those parties and those individuals who thought that socialism could be elected, could be brought in by peaceful parliamentary means, and those people who thought it could not be, and that a violent revolution to overthrow the capitalists was going to be necessary. And that was Lenin's stance, whereas the Mensheviks were basically oriented towards the position that capitalism had to develop in Russia, had to go through a long, probably prolonged period of evolution before the country could be industrialized, before a large proletariat could be formed. And then either there would be a revolution, or, as most of the Mensheviks thought, they would have so much support that they would be able to vote in socialism. That was the Menshevik position. And the Bolshevik position was that this was not going to be possible, that they needed to prepare for revolution, to overthrow the government. And that's what eventually took place. Once the revolution took place, some Mensheviks joined the Bolshevik Party. Many of them stuck to their principles that said, this is premature, this is never going to work, we need to we need to have a bourgeois capitalist government which will industrialize the country, and only at the end of that process would be able to have a revolution. Some of them stayed in Russia, some of them moved abroad, and became important forces in the anti-communist movement, the important forces in the world capitalist movement, if you want to oppose the Soviet Revolution.
What influence did the First World War have? Because, Stalin was, if I'm correct, he was appointed General Secretary in 1922 on Lenin's recommendation.
Right.
A few years earlier, the Tsar family were executed. What was going on there around the time of the First World War?
There was let's start with the revolution. Stalin, for the most part, was in exile in Siberia during most of the First World War. He left, as I said, when the February Revolution took place, and that's when, and then shortly after that, Lenin arrived. The First World War created the preconditions, if you want, or sped up the developing preconditions for the revolution. The First World War was a disaster for Russia. The soldiers were poorly trained, very poorly armed, and after an initial period, very poorly motivated. And the Bolsheviks had a movement to recruit members among the military, and their activities to build a communist base among the military were very important. But Stalin was not involved in that. Let's just be clear. One of the people who was involved in it, one of the many, was a guy named Clement Voroshilov, who became a close ally of Stalin's and eventually became the Minister of Defense, or the People's Commissar for Defense in the Soviet Union. So the the Bolshevik organization in the army was very important, but Stalin was not centrally involved in that. Then there was a civil war, which lasted, let's say, roughly 4 years, fighting against the forces that wanted to reestablish the Tsarism, okay, who are called the Whites. There were a number of leaders of these armies, also fighting against the interventionists, soldiers from more than a dozen countries in Europe and Asia and the United States sent troops to try to suppress the Russian Revolution. They didn't make any serious headway and withdrew the troops after a few years, but that was a serious attempt to overthrow the.
Sorry, when was this, though, more or less? What year?
The revolution was 1917. The intervention is 1918 to 1921.
Right, okay. And the war was from 1913
war
to
was
about
1914 to 1918, right? August 1914 was the beginning of the First World War. One of the things the Bolsheviks did immediately after seizing power was withdraw from the war. Okay, the war was phenomenally unpopular, and not only that, but it was killing millions of people, including millions of Russian soldiers, and the Russian army experienced a serious revolt, which precluded the Whites from really being able to seize the Russian army and turn it around against the Bolsheviks. They were never able to really do that. Eventually, the Bolsheviks recruited many soldiers and others to their own side, to the Red Army, and defeated the armies of the Whites. And there was an invasion. Well, the newly formed Polish state invaded Russia in 1918. There was a war against to push the Poles back. The front lines went back and forth. Eventually, the Soviet Russia, wasn't the Soviet Union yet, signed a treaty with Poland because they just couldn't fight anymore. And likewise, they signed a treaty with the Germans to stop fighting against Germany, to withdraw from the Allied side because they just didn't have the strength. They wanted to be able to consolidate their forces. Stalin was very active in the war, in the civil war in various places in Russia as a commissar and a commander of troops.
Now, what about the famous testament from Lenin?
Sure. I wrote a book about that called The Fraud of the Testament of Lenin. Okay. The basic story is something like this. Lenin had a number of strokes in 1922. He could not write. He didn't have control over his hands after a stroke in December 1922. And he dictated some materials to secretaries. A few of these articles, or let's call them articles, were very critical of Stalin and very more positive to Trotsky. Not entirely uncritical, but more positive towards Trotsky. Okay. That didn't have any effect on the, let's say, the elections for the Central Committee and so forth in the party congresses during the 1920s. But I think it seems like they were basically accepted as genuine. So after the fall of the Soviet Union, let me try to make this quick. After the fall of the Soviet Union, some historians in Russia got privileged access to documents which no one else could see at that time, and I don't think anybody can see them now either. One of them, a man named Valentin Sakharov, a professor at Moscow University, got access to the Lenin archive. And he wrote his dissertation, and then he wrote a 700-page book with illustrations and so forth, where he argued that the articles that were dictated by Lenin after December 1922 up until his final stroke in the second week of March 1923, that some of those articles were genuine, but others were not genuine. They were not by Lenin. And he wrote a book to demonstrate this claim. As I said, it's 700 pages long. It was published in 2003. I bought it when it came out, more or less, and I looked at it and I said, oh my God, it's 700 pages long. I'm doing something else right now. I'll read it another day. Fast forward to the teens, 10 years ago or so. A historian named Stephen Kotkin, who at that time was at Princeton University, and of course, like all other legitimated historians, was extremely anti-Stalin and anti-communist, wrote the first volume of his biography of Stalin. Okay, that was in the mid-20 teens, and in that book, it's a very long book. But one of the things he did was to very carefully study Sakharov's book, and it convinced him. Now Kotkin was an extremely anti-Stalin, anti-communist scholar, but he was convinced by Sakharov's book that Sakharov had proven that the articles, these Lenin's last articles, the so-called Testament of Lenin, in which Lenin purportedly criticized Stalin, and even threatened to break off relations with him, were false, were fraudulent. And Kotkin accepted this. That was pretty interesting to me. So then I went back and studied Sakharov's book very carefully. And of course, other materials too that are related to that. And as a result of that, I wrote The Fraud of the Testament of Lenin. And I did it mainly because I thought, and I still think, that if I hadn't done it, no one would do it. This is a 700-page book in Russian. It has a kind of academic style. It's not easy reading. And the mainstream of Soviet history, all the way from the real right-wingers to the Trotskyists, are just not going to want to accept this. So they're going to ignore it. It's going to be ignored. And yet I thought that his evidence was very good. So I wrote a book about that, investigating it. I tried to go a little bit beyond his evidence, but his evidence is very good. Sakharov's evidence is very good. And I reproduced some of the documents that he himself reproduced in his book, in my book, so that you can see what he's talking about. So it seems that there was some sort of conspiracy, probably involving Trotsky, certainly involving Lenin's wife, not yet his widow, because Lenin was still alive, although after March 7th or 8th, 1923, Lenin could not speak. He had another stroke and, I believe, never spoke another word. There was some sort of conspiracy to weaken Stalin for some reason, perhaps just to create a situation whereby there was not one single inheritor, let's say, of Lenin's mantle, but maybe more than one, maybe trying to take Stalin down a peg or two and put Trotsky up a peg or two. It's not clear. But what is clear is that there was this kind of conspiracy to create these documents in which Lenin supposedly criticized Stalin. So it's a very interesting issue, although it did not really make much of a stir, except among the Trotskyists. The Trotsky and his followers, of course, thought this was wonderful because Lenin, in those same documents, said some positive things about Trotsky. Trotsky claimed that these documents really indicated that Lenin would like Trotsky to have replaced him as the leader of the Bolshevik Party. The documents don't say that, but they're very positive towards Trotsky. And then along comes Nikita Khrushchev in 1956, and he really used the testament of Lenin to discredit Stalin.
There's an anti-Stalin narrative that has dominated particularly Western history for the last few decades.
Yeah, since especially since Khrushchev, but before that too, because forget about Western, Soviet historiography from the time of the revolution, from virtually the time of the revolution, was not primarily about finding out the truth about events in the Soviet Union. Its primary task was to generate anti-communist propaganda for political purposes that could be used, to not only by governments but used as propaganda against communism. The ruling elites, the ruling classes in all of the Western capitalist countries were very afraid that the example of the Russian Revolution would spread to other countries. And of course, the Bolsheviks tried to do that, right? They set up the Communist International in 1919. Their goal was to stimulate revolutions in industrialized countries and anti-colonial movements in the empires of the Western imperialist countries. So the rulers of these countries, England, United States, particularly the European countries, were terribly afraid of the enthusiasm for the Russian Revolution that was generated among their own working classes. And there were attempted revolutions in Germany, of course, in Hungary. They were suppressed in Finland, also suppressed, but at the Baltic states, which sprang to existence along with Poland when the Russian Empire collapsed. So there was a great need among the capitalist countries in the world, among the capitalists anyway, for good anti-communist, anti-Bolshevik propaganda. And that was the main function of the academic study of Soviet history. There was a secondary function, which was to try to figure out what was really going on, and there were some good books published, but that wasn't the main thing that was happening. The main thing that was happening was an eager willingness to accept any kind of negative stories about what was going on in the Soviet Union. And since after the mid-20s, it was clear that Stalin was going to become the central leader of the Bolshevik Party and of the Soviet Union. Anything that would make Stalin look like a monster was going to be welcomed in important circles in the West.
Now, the 1930s were a particularly significant decade, and you've pointed out that the 1936 Stalin Constitution was evidence of perhaps genuine democratic intent. I think you note things like universal suffrage, secret ballots, contested elections, and that was a lot more progressive than many Western democracies at that time.
So Stalin, as I pointed out, and of course here I'm drawing on Russian historians as well as on primary sources. The Russian historians, of course, can guide you to sources that you might not have seen otherwise. Stalin really wanted to have contested elections, contested secret elections where all the voters had equal power under the 1924 Constitution of the Soviet Union. It was set up so that working class areas had more influence than peasant areas, than country areas, for example. So Stalin wanted this kind of constitution, and he got it, but it was not implemented. And I point that out in one or two of my books, that in the Central Committee plenums of 36 and 37, the Stalin leadership argued for acceptance and support for contested elections. But on, I believe the date was October the 10th, 1937, when there was a meeting of the Politburo, even some members of Stalin's Politburo thought that they could not permit this. Now, they had been led to believe that there was a widespread, and maybe more than one widespread, rebellion in the far reaches of the Soviet Union in various places to overthrow the Soviet government. So that was one of the explanations for why, or the rationales for why the contested elections were canceled. Elections were held. Some of the candidates were chosen by the Communist Party and were not necessarily members of the Communist Party, but there were no contested elections. And Stalin tried again after the Second World War to revive this kind of a democratic, if you want to put it that way, a democratic political order, but he was not able to do it. Okay, and we don't know all the details, but it just didn't happen.
Then came the purges.
Well, okay, that was the 1930s. Okay, so let's back up a little bit. During the 1920s, there was here was the situation in the early 1920s. The Bolsheviks had, in many respects, counted on revolutions in other, particularly Western industrial countries, that would support the Soviet Union and aid the Soviet Union in some ways, because the Soviet Union had been devastated, first of all, by the First World War, second of all, by the very wide-ranging Civil War, which was also very destructive, and then there was a very serious famine and epidemic in the early 1920s, which took many lives. And so the Soviet Union in the early 1920s was in terrible shape. And when it became clear that revolutions were not going to take place in Western European countries, which were more industrialized than Russia, certainly, there was a vigorous debate in the Bolshevik Party. What are we going to do now? Marx, Engels, and Lenin did not write a blueprint for how you get from where Russia was, where the Soviet Union was in the early 1920s, this basically devastated country with a small working class to begin with, and many of whom had been killed or had gone back to the farms to try to work there to get something to eat. Really a devastated country. What should be done? And that was what the debate in the party conferences and congresses during the 1920s was all about. And this gave rise to opposition movements in opposition to the leadership of the Bolshevik Party. To put it quickly, Leon Trotsky and a few others became the major leaders of this opposition movement. Now, in 1921, at a party congress, the 10th Party Congress, under Lenin's instructions, or Lenin's insistence, a resolution was passed that forbade fractions, or the Americans call it factions, within the Bolshevik Party, okay? They had this idea, this concept of democratic centralism, which meant that there would be discussion at the party conferences and congresses over what the line should be, and then it would be voted on. And once the line was voted on and decided at these high-level party meetings, everyone should follow that line. And factionalism, or fractionalism, was to be forbidden because factions would organize around their own line. They would try to organize to win people around whatever their particular line was. And that contradicted the idea of centralism. The democracy was in the discussions, and then the centralism was everybody tries to put the line into effect. A number of people were expelled from the party in the later 1920s for continuing to factionalize, for not dissolving these opposition movements. Most of those people then recanted, and we're talking about, significant party leaders here, the local leaders and regional leaders of the party, fairly prominent people, most of them men. Most of those people who were expelled for factionalism in the late 1920s recanted, asked to be readmitted to the party, vowed that they would support the party line and would abjure any kind of oppositional activity. But many of them did not. And so they continued to exist underground. And I've written about that in a few of my books. Now, in December 1934, the first secretary of the Leningrad Party was a man named Sergei Kirov, was assassinated. He was shot in the head right outside his office in the headquarters of the party. And the man who shot him tried to commit suicide, but out of nervousness, evidently, he did not succeed. And he was arrested. And this is a man named Nikolaev. He was interrogated. He at first denied everything, but then he started to name names. He started to say, well, I didn't kill Kirov, but if I had wanted to kill Kirov, here's who I would have asked to help me, this kind of thing. And so he started to talk. And then, of course, the GPU, the political police, went out and arrested those people and started to interrogate them. And they started to name other names. So pretty quickly, the people who had been involved in Nikolaev's group planning the assassination of Kirov mentioned that they were in touch with two former top party leaders named Zinoviev and Kamenev, who were living in Moscow. See, all this was happening in Leningrad. They said they were in touch with Zinoviev and Kamenev. So it became clear that there was some kind of conspiracy. Well, the men who were involved in the Kirov assassination were executed in late December 1936. But then Zinoviev, Kamenev, and some of their associates back in Moscow were put on trial. They were given prison sentences. They confessed that, yes, they had been in touch with these people. They had been in touch with these people who had assassinated Kirov. They had not told them to do that. They were horrified that they had done that, but they had been in touch with them, and they hadn't reported that to the party. So they were given prison sentences. But that's where the story begins. The political police, who by this time were called the NKVD, they worked in the Department of the Interior, started to investigate these people's contacts, and by early 1936, there was they found a number of figures, a number of people who confessed that they were Trotskyists and that they were bent on assassinating leading political figures. That led to the Moscow trials. The first Moscow trial was August 1936. The second one, January 1937, and the third one, March 1938. Now, the transcripts of those trials, the edited transcripts, have been available for many years. And of course, they were famous at the time. There's never been any evidence that the statements, the confessions, and the details given by the defendants in those trials were made under compulsion. But that was the claim of people who wanted to believe that. And by the time Khrushchev comes along and denounces Stalin, Khrushchev's and his people just simply declared that all these people were framed. Okay, it took a few years for him to get that far, but they declared that. Now, Khrushchev was ousted in 1964. Leonid Brezhnev came in, and there were a few short-lived first secretaries of the party after Brezhnev's death in 1982. And then Mikhail Gorbachev came along. And Gorbachev carried on a campaign of attacks on Stalin even more vigorously than the one carried out by Khrushchev. So, but again, did not present, did not publish any evidence. So all during this time, except for the testimony at the Moscow trials, we really don't have any evidence that these trials were, that the people in these trials were tortured or threatened or forced to make false confessions. Since the end of the Soviet Union, we have a tremendous amount of documentation, including statements by a great many people who were either centrally or peripherally involved with these conspiracies, who confirm that these conspiracies really did exist. And we also have some evidence from the Trotsky archive at Harvard University. That is to say, Trotsky and his son, who at that time lived in Paris, had a correspondence about, some correspondence about the underground Trotskyites. So that's, I would say, an important aspect of what you call the purges. The purges is not really the best word. A party purge was really a kind of a vetting of members to see if they, are good party members or not. This is really kind of a misnomer, but that's the word that has become popularly used for these trials of conspirators. In 1936, late 1936, the man who was in charge of the NKVD, the Interior Department, if you want, the People's Commissar for Internal Affairs, but which included, of course, the political police, was dismissed from office. A guy named Genrich Jagoda, and was replaced by a man named Nikolai Yezhov. Now, during the next 2 years, 1937 to 1938, Yezhov and his men killed something like 600,000, actually closer to 700,000 Soviet citizens. And I think that is the period, that is the phenomenon that, for the most part, people who research the Soviet period, of the Stalin period, of the Soviet Union, are concerned with. Did Yezhov do this at Stalin's behest, or did he do it behind the back of the Soviet government? I wrote a little book about this, and of course others have written too, though mainly in Russian, that the evidence is he did it behind the back of the Soviet government. When it was discovered by the Stalin and the central leadership that Yezhov was doing this kind of stuff, he was either dismissed or persuaded to resign. In any case, he left his post. He was replaced by Lavrentiy Beria, who started to investigate what Yezhov had been up to. And in late January 1939, Beria, Malenkov, and one or two other members of the Politburo, the leading group of the Soviet Party, issued a report to Stalin detailing some of the atrocities that Yezhov's men had been engaged in. So Yezhov and his men were arrested over the next few months. They confessed to doing all these things. I put Yezhov's confessions both in the original Russian and also in English translation on my webpage back in 2010. These are not hard to find. They're very revealing, and it's clear that Yezhov and company had their own conspiracy, and they had part of that conspiracy was to engender discontent among the Soviet population by these ruthless and murderous means. And they succeeded over, it took them a while, but they succeeded in sowing quite a lot of discontent. And then, of course, they were caught, they were confessed, tried, arrested, and executed, and so forth. But the Soviet government, for reasons that we do not know, the Soviet government never went public that this is what had happened. And I think that it was, not only in retrospect, but at the time, should have been seen as a terrible mistake, that they should have done that. I understand I think I understand why they didn't do it. The Soviet Union was threatened, was expecting a war, expecting to be invaded, attacked either by Germany or Poland or even the Western Allies, England and France, and had been attacked and were to be attacked again very shortly by Japan. The Soviet Union fought two wars, one in 1938, one in 1939, against Japan. So the Soviet Union was seriously under threat, and I believe the reason that they did not, that the Stalin government did not come clean about what Yezhov's crimes and what Yezhov and company had done, was because they did not want to appear as though the country was seriously divided. But that's just a hypothesis. The fact of the matter is they did not announce to the Soviet population and to the world, in effect, of what Yezhov had done, had been just massacring people without trial, without any evidence of guilt. They didn't want to admit that the country had conspirators in such high positions that they could cause this kind of damage.
We are running out of time, but
Sure.
no conversation about Stalin can be had without including the famine of 32. This is one of the most frequent bullets shot
Sure.
at Stalin.
The best research on Soviet agriculture generally, and the famine specifically, is done by Mark Tauger, who just recently retired from West Virginia University, but he spent his professional life studying Soviet agriculture from primary sources. I discovered him, maybe 2010, 2011 or something, and immediately got in touch with him because his work just stands out. Now, Tauger is not a leftist. I mean, he's a liberal, but he's not a leftist in any way. And his research is based on primary sources and is extremely objective. He's not pro-Stalin, certainly. And he demonstrates that the famine was not man-made. The famine was caused by bad natural conditions, flooding in some areas, drought in other areas, crop diseases. The crop diseases are known as rust and smut. I looked them up one time. I can't tell you any more about them, but they are serious crop diseases. There were infestations of insects in some areas and even an infestation of field mice. So there were very serious famine, very serious crop failures due to these conditions. And the Soviet government didn't understand that this was a widespread phenomena until around January 1933, at which time they started to provide aid to those areas that were seriously affected by the famine. And there was a good famine in 1933, a good harvest in 1933, which put an end to the famine. So Tauger has documented this very well. When I wrote this up for two of my books some years ago, I actually sent those parts to Mark Tauger to say, please criticize them. Please let me know if I have the research correct here. I want to be accurate. And he made a few corrections, and he said, okay, go ahead, go with it. That's basically accurate. It's important to note, and no one does note it, that there were 4 famines in the Soviet Union in the 1920s alone. So famine had been a feature of Soviet agriculture for at least 1,000 years. Every 3 or 4 years, there would be a famine, and every decade or so, a very serious famine. And of course, the people who suffered most are the poor peasants who had no or very little land. And the agricultural techniques, were basically medieval. So that gave the Stalin government that instilled in them the conviction that they had to collectivize agriculture. And they sent agronomists to the United States to investigate, to study large-scale American Midwestern farms and the methods used there, and then set up a few demonstration farms to see how that would work in Russia, and then eventually collectivized agriculture. And without the collectivization of agriculture, the industrialization could never have taken place, and famines would have continued. So that's the story of the famine. But of course, the Ukrainian nationalists and other anti-communists have said that it was a man-made famine, either caused deliberately or by incompetence by the Soviet government. And it just so happens that that's not true. You have to read
This
the
is what-
primary sources. You have to go back. I have them. I've
Yeah.
summarized. I've summarized a lot of Snyder's research in a couple of my books, so that and with the footnotes if you want to look further. But that's
I might have this wrong, but I believe that Mao himself had some relationship with the famine in terms of, because remember, China also had big famine issues.
Sure.
But I can't remember the connection.
I don't know that there's a connection, but okay. So after the Chinese Revolution, and this is beyond my field of expertise, but after the Chinese Revolution, it seems to me that the Chinese were basically following what you might call the Stalin blueprint for building socialism. So they collectivized agriculture. That was up until about 1956 or so. They even had a rural people's commune movement where they went beyond just the collective farms to collectively owned farms, communes. Then there was this great leap forward, which was in some respects like the first 5-year plan in the Soviet Union. And then there was a serious famine, okay, in China. And a number of people in the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party seized on this famine. They also, by this time, were listening to Khrushchev. Khrushchev's speech was 1956. So the Chinese had always followed the leadership of the Soviet Union. So when Khrushchev gave that speech and then continued to criticize Stalin, some leaders of the Chinese Communist Party, there may be more to it than this, but this is at least the case. Some leaders of the Chinese Communist Party said, well, listen, we can't follow the Stalin model anymore. Khrushchev just exposed how bad it is, how terrible this was. We can't do this. And Mao disagreed. Now, it's not like they understood the ins and the outs, all the details that we have today, but Mao disagreed. And in the meanwhile, there was this Sino-Soviet dispute that started in 1957. Mao and some of the other leaders of the Chinese Communist Party decided that Khrushchev was using this attack on Stalin. And it's not that they disbelieved what he said, but that Khrushchev was using this attack on Stalin to reverse certain basic principles of Marxism-Leninism, like, for example, the need for revolution to overthrow capitalism, right? Khrushchev was for peaceful coexistence, right? We can elect socialism in, Euro-communism was the result of that. So, yeah, there is a kind of connection. I have not investigated it closely, but I hope somebody does. There is a kind of important connection between Khrushchev's attack on Stalin and the developments in China that eventually led to the Cultural Revolution, for example. Okay, which, anyway.
Stalin died in 1953, and you argue he was quite politically isolated. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, he seems to have been. In 1947, Stalin and other leaders around him drafted a new constitution for the Soviet Union and a blueprint for how to develop towards communism. And this document, which was, of course, secret for decades, was finally published without much fanfare about 10 years ago. A little bit of it was published before that, and I write a little bit about this at the very end of my 2005 article, Stalin and the Struggle for Democratic Reform, Part 2. But now we have the whole document. And it's clear that Stalin wanted to have the Soviet Union evolve more towards much more democratic system where the state would play a much smaller role and take some more steps towards communism. I'm probably going to write something about that one of these days. And the 19th Party Congress in October 1952 had as its sort of main theme, the next step towards communism, the next pushing on towards communism. And Stalin wrote a book called Economic Problems of Socialism in the Soviet Union. And that was the leading publication that was discussed by everybody at the 19th Party Congress. Stalin then, that was in October 52, Stalin dies in March 53, and very quickly that book disappears off the shelves. Nobody talks about it anymore. The resolutions that were made at the 19th Party Congress and then at the Central Committee meeting right after it were forgotten about. So it's clearly, once Stalin died, the rest of the party leadership just was not in support of these initiatives. What
do you think Putin thinks of Stalin?
Oh, he's said many times what he thinks about Stalin. I mean, not that I follow everything, but he's said it a few. Okay, so Putin defends the role of the Stalin leadership in World War II. And in fact, I've just finished a book about the run-up to World War II, which shows that only the Soviet Union was really trying to stop Hitler. The Western European countries, actually, many of their leaders liked Hitler, and they didn't want to stop him. And they were willing to sacrifice Poland in order to accommodate Hitler. That position has become pretty well documented since Michael J. Carley of University of Montreal has published his huge three-volume study of the period leading up to World War II. It's just very clear. He finished his last volume about a year ago, and he demonstrates that that's very clear too. Putin defends the Soviet Union's role in trying to fend off Hitler and the fascists, but he does not defend Stalin, collectivization, industrialization. But there are some but there's contradictions too. There was
it's nuanced.
Yeah, I don't know that he's so nuanced, but for example, one of the top figures in the Soviet military, a historian, published a few years ago a statement that, it's clear that the Marshal Tukhachevsky and the other generals who were tried and executed for plotting with Germany and Japan to overthrow the Soviet government, something we didn't talk about in this interview, it's clear that they were guilty. Now, I and my colleagues, Vladimir and Sven Erik, have published a book about this. There's a huge amount of evidence that Marshal Tukhachevsky and the other generals who were tried and executed with him in June 1937 were, in fact, in collaboration with the Germans and Japanese. Another reason why the Soviet leadership felt so much under siege, right, is that there were these high-level conspiracies, including with the fascists. But Putin hasn't made any statements about that. In Russia, the single largest party in Russia is the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. Now, it's not what you would call a revolutionary party, but there are still millions of people in Russia who identify strongly with communism, whatever that means, okay, whatever that means to them. And that's not the case in the rest of what used to be the communist bloc, right? The Baltics, Finland, the other Eastern European countries. It's not the case. In fact, in most of those countries, communist parties are outlawed. They're essentially illegal. But in Russia, there's a very large number of people who are very pro-communist and even pro-Stalin. And on the other hand, there are many forces in Russia many people, especially among the intelligentsia. I don't want to beat up on the intelligentsia as such, but many members of the intelligentsia have never been pro-communist and have always been very anti-Stalin. It's sort of reminiscent of the 19th century or the 18th and 19th century feuds in Russia between the Westernizers and the Slavophiles. You know, I mean, it's not exactly that, but it's the people who support the Soviet Union, people who support Stalin, people who support the goals of communism and who identify with them, versus the people who abhor them. And Russia is seriously divided in that way. So I think Putin, whereas of course he was a Yeltsin man, Yeltsin was super anti-Stalin, Yeltsin was a Gorbachev man, but Putin straddles the fence, although I think on the whole he comes down in an anti-Stalin position, but around certain positions he certainly defends the Soviet record and the record of the Soviet Union during Stalin, and particularly in the build-up to World War II. Now, I've written one book and just finished writing another book on the Katyn massacre. Putin hasn't come out with any position on that. He's kind of gone along with the mainstream view that Stalin and company had all of these Polish prisoners shot. But there are many people in Russia who do not accept that story, and I myself don't accept it. But we don't have time to talk about that right now, I suppose.
I really do appreciate your ability to compress so much of this history into such a short time. I understand that it's an incredibly complex topic and very, very big. I guess, Grover, the moral of the story is that if you are looking for the truth, you're not going to find that in mainstream institutions.
Yes, objectivity and primary source evidence. And there's very little of that. Also, just let me mention that there's this phenomenon which I call the anti-Stalin paradigm. You can't get published. You can't have a career in the field of Soviet history in any country that I know of, except maybe China, and I don't know about that, unless you attack Stalin. I've been told that by some people in that field that I know, that I respect, that, Grover, why don't you say some bad things about Stalin? Nobody's going to take you seriously unless you say bad things about Stalin, because that's the position you must have if you're going to have a career in the field of Soviet history. And otherwise, you won't have a career, you won't get published, you won't get hired. Fortunately for me, I am not in that field. I teach medieval European literature, and I can do all of this, and it doesn't affect my career or my job.
How can my audience get your books?
Amazon? Is there an Amazon South Africa?
There's Amazon everywhere.
Not everywhere, but there's Amazon a lot of places. If there's an Amazon South Africa, they're all there. That's the easiest way if you live outside the United States. Of course, my publisher.
My audience is international.
Pardon me?
My audience is international.
Yes. Okay. Well, my publisher is. You can also get them from my publisher, but I think the simplest thing to tell you right now is go to Amazon. All of my books in English, and some of them in translation, many of them in translation, are on Amazon. Okay? There's been a number of them have been translated into other languages: German, Italian, Spanish, Russian, of course, Polish, stuff like that. But Amazon is the easiest place to go, and you won't have to pay shipping costs from the United States to wherever it is you live, right? You'll just be able to get them there. So go to Amazon.com. They're all listed there.
Grover Furr, thank you for joining me in the trenches.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Jeremy. I appreciate it very much.